The instructors announced the new survival module early in the morning, just as the rising sun cast thin, sharp lines of golden light across the training valley. The alien cadets stood in formation, whispering nervously among themselves, because there was never a good reason for the instructors to gather everyone before the day properly began. The academy was notorious for its merciless trials, but this atmosphere felt heavier than usual. The air carried a strange tension, like the world itself knew that something brutal was about to start. Aaron, the only human in the group, sensed the shift immediately. He watched the instructors with a calm expression, though he could feel the nervous excitement building inside him. He had grown accustomed to their unpredictable methods, but he still respected the danger of each test. One of the senior instructors stepped forward, her tall frame casting a shadow across the cadets. She raised her clawed hand for silence, and the valley became still. With a slow, deliberate voice, she announced that for the next 3 days, all provided food sources would be completely removed from the camp. No rations, no nutrient packs, no emergency reserves. Everything had been hidden. The cadets were to survive entirely on what the environment offered, and the instructors would observe without interfering. The murmur that followed her statement spread like a trembling wave. Some cadets instinctively checked their belts, hoping to find a forgotten snack or compressed bar. Others looked toward the forest beyond the ridge, knowing that the local plants were considered inedible for their species. Aaron did not move. He simply studied the valley, already piecing together the situation. While panic quickly took hold among the alien cadets, Aaron felt a peculiar sense of familiarity wash over him. On Earth, periods of scarcity were woven into the history of every culture. He remembered stories of sailors fermenting vegetables during long voyages, farmers drying herbs to survive harsh winters, and explorers roasting tough roots to make them edible. The instructors assumed the region was barren, but to Aaron, nothing about a landscape was ever truly empty. Even the most hostile environments hid something useful for those who knew how to look. His pulse remained steady as he waited for the commotion to settle. The instructors dismissed the formation, and chaos erupted instantly. Several cadets sprinted toward the supply shelters, convinced that something must have been overlooked. Others ran into the field, shouting in frustration as they overturned stones and pulled up plants, only to drop them when the bitter smell reached their sensitive senses. Many species in the group had strict dietary limitations, and the planet's flora contained compounds that irritated or sickened them. The disbelief on their faces deepened as more discoveries ended in disappointment. Aaron walked among them, observing quietly. He had no intention of following the others' frantic search. Instead, he knelt beside clusters of low brush and examined the leaves, stems, and roots with calm precision. From the moment he arrived at the academy, Aaron noticed how alien cadets tended to classify plants in rigid categories: edible, toxic, useless. There was no nuance in their approach. Most of the time, they avoided anything unfamiliar unless an instructor explicitly declared it safe. But humans came from a world where necessity forced creativity. Fermentation, drying, roasting, and soaking had transformed countless poisonous or bitter materials into nutritious food throughout Earth's long history. Aaron did not need instructions to know that processing could change everything about a plant. Even now, as he inspected the razor-edged leaves of a wild shrub, he saw opportunities the others could not recognize. He took a moment to analyze the environment. The valley was wide and filled with dense vegetation, but most of it had strong odors or textures alien cadets instinctively avoided. To Aaron, the sharp scents suggested the presence of tannins, acids, or alkaloids that humans had learned to tame over centuries. He ran his fingers along the surface of a fibrous root protruding from the ground. The exterior was tough, almost bark-like, but beneath it he sensed moisture and density. It reminded him of the coarse roots once used in traditional Earth villages to make fermented broths and preserved slices. He felt a glimmer of confidence. The instructors had not removed nature's offerings. They had only removed the cadets' certainty. As the sun climbed higher, the desperation of the others became louder. Two cadets argued near the stream, accusing each other of hiding secret reserves. Another group squeezed berries between their fingers, gagging at the acrid smell. The sight almost made Aaron smile. The berries were indeed impossible to eat raw, but he recognized their structure. With proper fermentation, many similar plants lost their toxicity and developed edible sugars. The problem was that no one here had the patience or cultural background to attempt such methods. Every alien cadet wanted immediate results, not slow transformation. This trial was designed to crush that impulse, and Aaron could already feel the instructor's eyes on him, evaluating every small decision he made. Instead of chasing after scraps like the others, he took a slow walk toward the deeper part of the valley. He needed to understand what the terrain naturally provided before making a plan. He crouched near a cluster of pods hanging from a thick, twisted vine. When he split one open, a powerful, sour aroma burst forth. Most aliens would avoid it because the acidity irritated their tongues, but to Aaron, the scent was promising. Acidic plants often became far more palatable when dried or roasted. Some could even be turned into crisp, nutrient-rich slices if processed correctly. He tucked the pod remains into a small pouch at his belt, already imagining what he could turn them into. The instructors continued to watch from the cliffs, silently judging every cadet's actions. They expected failure, especially among the species that depended on regimented nutrient packs. They had likely designed this trial to measure adaptability rather than brute strength. Aaron could almost feel their curiosity sharpening as he moved with purpose instead of panic. He knew that succeeding here required more than gathering a few edible leaves. He needed to transform what the valley provided into food that would not only sustain him, but prove that even the harshest environments could be conquered with knowledge. When dusk approached, the cadets returned to camp empty-handed, exhausted, and demoralized. Aaron arrived later, carrying a modest collection of plants, roots, pods, and bark. The others looked at him with confusion and pity, certain he had made a pointless effort. None of them believed that any of those items could be consumed without causing pain or sickness. He did not argue with them or explain his intentions. He simply arranged his findings beside a flat stone and sat down with calm determination. The instructor's announcement had not intimidated him. If anything, it clarified his path. For the next 3 days, he would rely on methods the others did not understand, and he felt ready for the challenge. By the time night settled, the cadets lay restless and hungry, while Aaron examined the plants under the faint light of the camp's lanterns. He broke open roots, tasted tiny fragments to test their bitterness, and pressed leaves to identify their oils. Everything around him held potential. The instructors had hidden the food, but they had overlooked something far more powerful: the human ability to transform the inedible into nourishment. As he worked, he knew the real trial was only beginning, and the coming days would separate instinctive panic from deliberate innovation. He felt no fear, only curiosity and anticipation for what he would create next. When dawn broke over the valley, Aaron was already awake, kneeling beside the small pile of plants he collected the previous evening. The cold morning air sharpened his senses, and the faint mist drifting over the ground made the valley look almost untouched, as if no one had spent the night in restless hunger. He felt a quiet determination settle inside him. The chirping of small insect-like creatures echoed through the brush, creating a steady rhythm as he began sorting through the materials he had gathered. Each piece had a different texture, scent, and potential. He knew that the instructors had designed this trial to push the cadets beyond brute force survival. For him, this meant reading the environment correctly and transforming what the valley offered rather than attempting to endure hunger. The alien cadets around the camp looked hollow-eyed and exhausted from their fruitless search the day before. Some sat hunched over, their hands pressed to their stomachs, while others stared suspiciously at the plants in Aaron's possession. A few whispered among themselves, convinced that he was wasting time. He ignored the looks and the murmurs. Hunger often drove individuals toward fear or impatience, but for him, hunger was simply another variable to manage. He ran his fingers over a long, twisted root and felt its dense weight. When he snapped it cleanly in half, the interior revealed a pale, starchy flesh that released a sharp, almost medicinal scent. This intrigued him. Strong aromas usually indicated compounds that could be processed or neutralized through methods Earth cultures had used for centuries. He took a small fragment and pressed it against his tongue, letting the bitterness spread. The taste was strong enough to make his eyes water, but the reaction told him exactly what he needed to know. The bitterness came from heat-sensitive compounds, which meant roasting or prolonged soaking could soften or break them down. He placed the root aside with a small sense of victory forming inside him. If he managed the process correctly, this plant alone could provide a stable carbohydrate source for days. The cadets had labeled these roots as inedible for generations, simply because no one had attempted to understand them. He felt a quiet thrill at the idea of being the first. Next, he examined the pods split open from the vine he found deeper in the valley. The sourness that burst from it last night had faded slightly, leaving behind a tangy, almost citrus-like scent. He lifted one of the seeds and pressed it between his fingers. The oily residue coated his skin, confirming his suspicion that the pod's acidity came from natural fermentation precursors. To many species in the camp, that acidity was unbearable, but to him, it was a familiar sign of potential transformation. Acidic pods, when processed correctly, often produced stable, energizing foods. He sliced a small piece of the pod's inner flesh with the tip of his blade and let it rest on his tongue for only a moment. The shock of sour intensity hit immediately, but beneath it, he detected faint sugars. This was promising. Sugars could feed fermentation, making the plant far more valuable than anyone realized. He continued sorting through the plants, moving with a combination of patience and instinct. The slender leaves he examined next had a waxy coat that released a pungent herbal smell when pressed. The oils were too strong to consume directly, but he recognized the plant as something similar to one of Earth's wild herbs used for seasoning after being roasted and crushed. These leaves could become flavoring or even a mild preservative. The idea of creating not only food but seasoned food amused him, though he kept the thought to himself. The cadets around him would never believe such plants could become anything more than irritants. As he worked, he became increasingly aware of the instructors watching from the ridge. He could not see them clearly from where he sat, but he felt their presence like a weight on his back. They were studying him with the same intensity he used when analyzing each plant. He wondered if the instructors expected his approach, or if they assumed he would fall into the same trap as the others: panic, exhaustion, or aimless searching. He continued working without looking their way, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of acknowledging their scrutiny. When he finally rose to his feet, he carried a carefully selected bundle of roots, pods, and leaves. The next step required finding a workspace away from the anxious cadets. He chose a small clearing near a rocky outcrop where the sunlight fell in a steady, concentrated beam. This spot would help him identify which plants reacted positively to heat and which required fermentation or soaking instead. He arranged each item neatly on a flattened slab of stone and began slicing thin layers from the roots. The fibers curled at the edges as he worked, releasing steam-like vapors in the cool morning air. Those vapors revealed everything he needed: how the compounds inside the plant changed when exposed to air, and how quickly the bitterness faded. He held a slice between his fingers and noticed how the color shifted from pale cream to a light gold after only a few minutes in the sun. That was a good sign. Plants that oxidized slowly were usually safe after moderate processing. Plants that oxidized quickly tended to contain irritating compounds that needed additional steps. He categorized each root slice accordingly, using small stones to keep the pieces separated. Every moment of analysis felt like piecing together a puzzle he had been preparing for since childhood. Next, he dealt with the pods. Their acidity fascinated him more than anything else he gathered. He scraped out the pulp and spread it thinly across the rock surface to observe how quickly it dried. The pulp's moisture evaporated faster than expected, leaving behind a sticky sheen. That meant the pulp contained enough sugar to ferment rapidly. He collected the seeds and inspected them one by one. Their oily coating was thick, but the seeds themselves held a firm structure he could potentially soften through controlled fermentation. While he worked, 2 cadets approached out of curiosity. They watched him slice and examine the plants in silence, their expressions tense. One of them finally spoke, asking if he genuinely believed anything in front of him could become edible. Aaron did not look up from his work as he answered calmly. He explained that plants were only useless to those who did not understand them. To him, every plant had a story and a process that could reveal its value. The cadets found no comfort in his explanation and soon walked away, muttering that hunger was already affecting his judgment. He paid them no attention. He was not trying to convince anyone. His goal was survival through knowledge, not reassurance. As midday approached, the sunlight grew stronger, and the subtle changes in the sliced roots revealed which pieces would require roasting, which would need soaking, and which could be fermented. The pods reacted beautifully to the heat, becoming slightly darker and releasing more of their natural aroma. The acidity softened just enough to confirm that the first stage of processing would work. He felt a small wave of satisfaction, knowing he had identified the foundation of a nutritional plan. By the time he finished, he had organized everything into clear categories, each one tied to a different transformation method. The cadets nearby still looked hopeless and confused, unable to imagine how his careful preparation could lead to actual food. He did not respond to their frustration or their disbelief. Instead, he gathered his materials and carried them back to camp with steady, purposeful steps. His mind was already shifting toward the next phase: fermentation. What the instructors intended as a starvation challenge was becoming something entirely different in his hands. He would not simply survive these days, he would reshape the meaning of food on this planet. Aaron returned to the clearing he selected the day before, carrying the carefully sorted roots, pods, and leaves in a tightly bundled cloth. The morning sun had risen high enough to warm the stone outcrop, and the air carried a dryness that would help him prepare what he needed. He knelt beside the rock and unwrapped his collection with deliberate calm, already planning the next steps in his mind. Fermentation required containment, controlled moisture, and minimal contamination. He had none of the tools typically used for the process, but he had something better: an understanding of how humans had once adapted fermentation techniques long before glass jars or metal containers even existed. He examined the area and immediately noticed a series of thick, cylindrical branches fallen from a massive tree on the valley's edge. The wood had a smooth, almost hollow structure, created naturally by insect activity that carved out the interior without destroying the outer shell. Aaron picked up one of the branches and inspected the inside. The cavity was deep and clean enough to serve as a base for a fermentation vessel. He selected several more branches of similar size, taking only those intact enough to hold moisture without leaking. Carrying the branches back to his working space, he began shaping them. He used a sharp stone and the tip of his blade to smooth the interior surfaces further, scraping away residue and loose fibers until the inner walls felt solid and uniform. The cadets nearby watched from a distance, whispering among themselves, confused by the humans' decision to carve hollow logs rather than search for food. Aaron ignored the stares. Every minute mattered, and fermentation required time to develop. If he did not prepare the containers now, he would lose hours of crucial microbial activity that could mean the difference between success and failure. Once the branch containers were ready, he turned his attention to sealing them. He needed breathable covers, material that allowed gases to escape during fermentation while preventing insects or spores from entering. He considered his options and reached for the broad leaves he collected earlier. These leaves had naturally tough fibers and a waxy surface, which made them durable and resistant to tearing. He tested one by folding it over the mouth of the wooden cylinder, tapping lightly along the edges. The leaf held its shape perfectly. He repeated the process with several more, trimming them to size until each vessel had a fitted, breathable lid. However, the leaves alone would not stay in place. He searched the ground for vines thin enough to twist into binding cords. After gathering a bundle, he stripped the vines of excess bark and twisted the flexible inner fibers into long, rope-like strands. He wrapped the strands around the wooden vessels until each leaf cover stayed firmly sealed, allowing just enough space for air to pass. The process took longer than he expected, but the final result satisfied him. These crude jars were not elegant, but they were functional, purposeful, and perfectly suited for what came next. With the vessels ready, he shifted his attention back to the plants. The roots needed to be broken down further before fermentation could begin. He sliced them into thin strips, careful to maintain consistent thickness so the microbial activity would spread evenly. The aroma of the exposed flesh intensified as he worked, releasing hints of bitterness that made several cadets recoil when the wind shifted toward them. To Aaron, the scent was a sign of progress. Unprocessed, yes, but full of potential. He placed the sliced roots into a shallow stone basin and poured a small amount of water from his canteen over them. The water softened the fibers quickly, allowing him to massage the slices until they grew pliable. Next, he focused on the acidic pods. The pulp he scraped out the day before had dried slightly, forming a tacky layer across the rock surface. He gathered it carefully, rolling it into small clumps that still retained enough sugar to kickstart fermentation. The seeds required special handling. He scraped off the oily residue coating them and cracked a few open to check the inner flesh. Most were firm and suitable for fermenting alongside the pulp and roots. He mixed everything together, kneading the plant material into a thick, fragrant mass that began warming under his hands. That warmth meant the natural sugars had begun interacting with airborne microbes, exactly what he needed. He spooned the mixture into the hollow wooden vessels, packing it tightly, but leaving enough room for expansion. The aroma that rose from the containers shifted subtly as he worked. It no longer held the sharp, aggressive sourness of the raw pods. Instead, the mixture had begun producing a softer, almost earthy scent. He recognized the early signs of mild fermentation. It was slow, but it would strengthen over the next several hours. When the first vessel was full, he sealed it with the leaf cover and tied the vine strands tightly. The process repeated smoothly with each additional vessel until all the plant material was stored. He lined the jars in a shaded part of the clearing where the temperature stayed consistent throughout the day. Fermentation required stability, not direct sun. He brushed off his hands and stepped back to observe the setup. The jars stood arranged in a neat row, each one holding enough potential food to sustain him for days if the process succeeded. The cadets watching from across the clearing exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered to another that the human was performing rituals instead of survival tasks. Another insisted that the containers would rot or explode. Aaron heard their concerns but did not turn to acknowledge them. Hunger twisted their emotions, and he would not feed the tension with explanations they had no desire to understand. Instead, he focused on the next part of the plan. Fermentation was only the first step. Once the microbes began their work, the roots and pods would soften, their toxins would break down, and their flavors would mellow. But to ensure everything developed safely, he needed to monitor the jars throughout the day. He pressed his ear to one vessel and listened carefully. A faint bubbling sound vibrated against the wooden walls. That sound filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction. Life was already transforming the mixture inside, turning bitterness into nutrition, turning raw plant matter into usable food. Time passed slowly as he adjusted the jars, rotated them slightly to maintain even processing, and inspected each leaf cover for signs of swelling. The sun dipped gradually toward the western ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing. He felt the dryness of the air shift toward evening coolness, which would slow the fermentation but not halt it. He counted that as an advantage. Rapid fermentation risked spoilage. Slow fermentation offered stability. As dusk settled, he carried the jars closer to camp, arranging them behind a large stone where the temperature remained stable through the night. Several cadets followed him at a distance, whispering nervously as the jars emitted soft pops and faint hissing sounds. Those noises unsettled them, but Aaron knew they were the natural release of gases building inside. To him, those sounds were a quiet celebration of progress. When darkness finally blanketed the valley, Aaron sat beside the row of jars, listening to the rhythmic bubbling inside each container. The camp around him was restless again, cadets shifting uncomfortably, trying to sleep through gnawing hunger. He felt the emptiness in his own stomach, but it did not frighten him. He knew what was coming. By morning, the first stage of fermentation would be well underway. By the next day, he would have a foundation for real food. He rested his hands on the warm surface of the nearest jar, feeling the small pulses of life working inside. The instructors had intended to strip him and the others of every advantage. Instead, they had given him the perfect stage to demonstrate something they had forgotten to account for: the human ability to transform the inedible into nourishment through patience, observation, and skill. He closed his eyes, listening to the gentle bubbling, already planning the next phase: drying and roasting, the final steps that would turn these jars of fermenting plants into something no alien cadet had ever tasted. The morning after the fermentation began, Aaron woke with a sense of urgency. The bubbling inside the makeshift containers had changed in tone during the night. He could hear the difference even before he reached them. The jars produced a deeper, more active sound, a sign that the microscopic life inside had accelerated its work. He knelt beside the row of vessels, pressing his palm lightly against each wooden cylinder. The warmth they emitted confirmed his expectations. The fermentation was progressing, transforming the harsh raw plants into softer, safer material. He untied the bindings around the first jar and slowly lifted the leaf cover, letting the steam rise into the morning air. The aroma was sharp, but no longer aggressive. It carried a mild sweetness mixed with earthy undertones. This was exactly what he hoped for. He examined the contents more closely. The once rigid strips of root had softened and absorbed moisture evenly. The pod pulp had broken down into a malleable paste with streaks of darker color where sugars had begun to caramelize slightly. The seeds, once firm and oily, had expanded and split open, releasing their inner flesh. Everything inside the vessel had changed structure, as if the valley's plants were shedding their wild nature and offering something more cooperative in return. Aaron stirred the mixture gently with a carved stick, observing how easily the fibers separated. The bitterness he tasted earlier would now be less dominant. But fermentation alone was not enough. He needed to complete the transformation through drying and roasting before the food could be safely consumed. He sealed the jars again to let them rest for a few more hours and began preparing the drying racks. He walked toward the grove where he found the hollow branches the day before. The trees there grew long, flexible limbs that bent under their weight without breaking. He cut several of the thinner branches and carried them back to his working area. He stripped off the leaves and bark, leaving smooth, flexible rods that he could weave into a frame. He stuck 4 sturdy rods into the ground and tied them together at the top with twisted vine strands, creating an elevated triangle. Then he added 2 more sets of rods on the sides, forming a flat surface. He wove smaller branches across the frame, creating a rough lattice that allowed airflow from all directions. By the time he finished, the drying rack stood firm and wide enough to hold several layers of sliced food. The sun had risen higher, warming the air and creating ideal drying conditions. The alien cadets watched him silently from a distance, worn down by hunger. Some leaned against rocks, struggling to stay upright. Others stared at the rack with suspicion, convinced that nothing edible could come from the tasks he performed. Aaron did not address them. He could sense the tension building, but he knew the only answer he could offer would be the finished food itself. He returned to the jars and opened each one carefully. Using his carved stick, he scooped out the softened plant material and laid it onto the drying rack in thin, evenly spread layers. The roots formed long ribbons that glistened slightly in the sun. The pod pulp, now smooth and pliable, spread like paste across the lattice. The seeds rolled into small pockets between the branches. As the sunlight touched them, he could see vapor rising faintly, carrying away the excess moisture. This stage would allow the structure of the plants to stabilize, preparing them for the final roasting phase. The wind picked up throughout the morning, which helped the drying process. Aaron rotated the layers occasionally so that each piece received equal exposure to the warm air. He pressed down gently on the root slices, checking their firmness. They gradually shifted from limp, fermented strips into resilient pieces with a leathery texture. This was a promising sign. Properly dried roots would roast evenly and develop a mild, nutty flavor. The pod pulp dried more slowly, but he recognized the transformation immediately. As the moisture evaporated, the pulp formed thin, brittle sheets that hardened at the edges. Once roasted, these sheets would crumble easily, making them suitable as additions to other food or as standalone snacks. By midday, the sun was at its peak, radiating enough heat to warm the stones around him. Aaron knew he could use this intense heat to his advantage. He began preparing a roasting surface by gathering flat stones and arranging them in a circle. He stacked smaller stones beneath them to angle the upper stones toward the sun, creating a natural reflector. When the sun's rays struck the stones, the surfaces grew hot enough that he could barely touch them without burning his fingertips. He tested the heat by placing a small piece of dried root onto the stone. Within moments, the root released a faint aroma reminiscent of roasted grains. Satisfied, he removed the root slice and returned to the drying rack. He gathered the first batch of dried material and carried it to the roasting stones. He placed each piece carefully, ensuring they did not overlap. The stones radiated a steady heat that roasted the roots slowly, allowing the flavors to develop without burning. The aroma drifted through the clearing, drawing the attention of several cadets who had nearly given up on their own efforts. The scent puzzled them. It was warm, slightly sweet, and surprisingly pleasant. Some cadets stepped closer, unable to hide their curiosity. Aaron felt their eyes on him but kept working with focused patience. As the roots roasted, their color deepened from pale gold to a richer brown. He flipped them occasionally using a thin branch, watching as steam escaped in tiny bursts. The transformation fascinated him. Nature always offered subtle signals during cooking, and he had learned to read those signals long before arriving at the academy. When the roots reached the perfect texture, crispy on the edges, firm at the center, he removed them from the stones and set them aside to cool. Next, he turned to the pod pulp sheets. These required a different method. He placed the brittle sheets directly onto the hottest stones, allowing them to blister slightly. The heat caused the sugars within the pulp to caramelize, creating dark lines across the surface. The aroma that rose from the caramelizing pulp was even stronger than that of the roasted roots. It was sweet, tangy, and unexpectedly inviting. A few cadets gasped softly, unable to reconcile the scent with the plants they once believed were dangerous. Finally, he roasted the seeds. These roasted quickly due to their small size and natural oils. As they heated, they popped open even further, releasing tiny bursts of aroma. Once finished, they resembled small, nut-like pieces with a charred exterior and a softer interior. He poured them into a small cloth pouch and shook it gently to remove loose fragments. The afternoon drifted by as he worked. The sun gradually lowered, softening the intensity of the heat, but by then he had already completed the bulk of the roasting. His collection of transformed food grew into a small pile beside him. Each type of roasted material held a unique texture and scent. Some pieces looked like crisp vegetable strips. Others resembled brittle chips. The seeds looked like trail snacks. He examined everything carefully and nodded to himself. The transformation was complete. He returned to the drying rack to collect the last pieces and spread them out beside the roasted pile. The final product looked nothing like the plants he had gathered earlier. The roots no longer appeared tough or bitter. The pod sheets no longer held the unbearable acidity. The seeds no longer gleamed with their oily coating. Everything now carried the unmistakable signs of edible food processed through human ingenuity. Several cadets approached him hesitantly. Hunger had eroded their pride, leaving them desperate for anything that resembled sustenance. One asked him, in a weak voice, if the food was safe. Aaron looked up at the cadet and answered calmly that the plants had been transformed through fermentation, drying and roasting, stripping away the harmful elements and enhancing the nutritious ones. The cadet stared at the roasted roots, as if witnessing an impossible miracle. Aaron gathered the roasted pieces and arranged them neatly onto a large leaf. He knew the food was safe, but the final test would come soon, when he tasted it himself. The instructors still watched from the ridge, silent and unreadable. He could feel their anticipation growing as the sun dipped toward the horizon. He picked up one of the cooled root slices and held it between his fingers. The texture felt firm and crisp, perfectly roasted. He took a slow bite. The crunch echoed softly in the clearing. The flavor surprised even him, a mild sweetness mixed with a faint earthy note, entirely free of bitterness. The cadets who had gathered around him stared in stunned silence as he chewed thoughtfully. The instructors had expected hunger to break him. Instead, he had created food in a place where no one believed food could exist. He swallowed and looked at the roasted pile again, realizing that the final step was complete. Night approached, and the valley cooled. Aaron gathered the food and wrapped it securely in cloth. Tomorrow would bring the moment that changed everything, feeding the class and shocking the instructors with what he had accomplished. The night was colder than the previous ones, and Aaron could feel the chill settling into his bones as he sat beside the neatly wrapped bundle of food he created. He remained awake longer than usual, listening to the restless movements across the camp. Hunger had turned the cadet's sleep into something fragile and uneasy. Every few minutes he heard someone shift or groan softly. He understood their struggle, but he also knew that the coming morning would change the situation entirely. When he finally lay down, he rested his hand on the cloth bundle as if protecting it. The work he completed over the last 2 days would soon be tested not just by his own body, but by the entire class and the instructors who had designed this harsh trial. At the first sign of dawn, he rose and stretched quietly. The sun climbed slowly over the ridge, painting the valley in a pale golden light that revealed every tired face around him. The cadets looked even weaker now, their movements slow and hesitant. A few looked at him with a mixture of hope and doubt, unsure whether the food he prepared could truly sustain them. He understood their hesitation, yet he carried no frustration. He had chosen this path of transformation intentionally. He knew the process, trusted it, and believed the results would speak for themselves. He carried the cloth bundle toward the center of the camp. As he opened it, the aroma of roasted roots and caramelized pod slices drifted into the morning air. Several cadets lifted their heads, their eyes widening at the unfamiliar yet inviting scent. For a moment, the valley grew silent. Even the small insect-like creatures hiding in the brush seemed to pause. The food did not resemble anything grown in the region. It carried hints of sweetness, warmth, and a complexity none of the cadets expected from the harsh plants of this world. Aaron chose a flat stone as his work surface, unfolding the cloth carefully. He arranged the roasted roots, seeds, and thin sheets of processed pulp into separate sections. The food glowed softly in the early sunlight, as if announcing its readiness to be consumed. He tested another piece himself, breaking off a small bit of roasted pod sheet. The texture was exactly as he hoped, crisp and light, and when he placed it on his tongue, it dissolved into a tangy, slightly sweet flavor that lingered pleasantly. He nodded to himself. It was safe, nourishing, and stable. The first cadet approached him hesitantly. The cadet was a slender alien with large dark eyes and a trembling voice. He asked if Aaron would allow him to try a small piece. Aaron gave a short nod and handed him a thin roasted root slice. The cadet sniffed it cautiously, the scent triggering confusion more than fear. When he finally took a tentative bite, the crunch echoed faintly. His expression changed instantly. Surprise cut through the exhaustion clouding his face. He swallowed and looked at Aaron with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The cadet reached for another piece without hesitation. That simple act shattered the barrier holding the rest back. More cadets approached, some barely able to stand upright, others clutching their hands nervously as if afraid the food would vanish before reaching them. Aaron allowed each one to take a portion, watching closely for any reaction that suggested discomfort. Instead, relief and astonishment spread across their faces. The food, once feared and dismissed, now revived them in real time. A burst of color returned to their complexions. Their shoulders straightened. Their eyes settled with sharper focus. As more cadets gathered around him, the instructors finally descended from the ridge. The lead instructor approached with a measured pace, her expression controlled but tense. She folded her arms and studied the scene with unblinking intensity. The other instructors stood behind her, equally silent. None of them spoke at first. They simply observed the cadets eating the food Aaron prepared. After a long pause, the lead instructor asked Aaron how he achieved this transformation. Her tone was neutral, but he could sense the shock beneath it. He responded with calm precision, explaining how he fermented the harsh roots and acidic pods to break down toxins, then dried them to stabilize their structure, and finally roasted them to produce safe, flavorful nourishment. He spoke without arrogance or pride, but with the confidence of someone who understood the process intimately. The lead instructor knelt beside the stone and inspected the remaining food. She lifted one of the roasted roots and examined its texture. She held it between her claws and sniffed it lightly before placing it into her mouth. The instructors behind her stiffened, startled by her choice to eat something made from plants their academy had long considered unsuitable. She chewed slowly, assessing each part of the flavor. Her eyes narrowed, then widened faintly. When she swallowed, she looked at Aaron with something new in her expression: respect. She stood and addressed the other instructors. She spoke in a steady voice, announcing that Aaron had succeeded in the module not by bending the rules, but by expanding the very definition of survival. He did not resist the environment. He collaborated with it. He used knowledge instead of instinct, precision instead of fear. In doing so, he not only fed himself, but also demonstrated that the valley's vegetation had been misjudged for years. The announcement triggered a wave of astonishment among the cadets. Many had believed the trial was unwinnable. Now, standing in the presence of undeniable proof, they realized that their understanding of food and survival had been far narrower than they imagined. Some approached Aaron, thanking him with sincerity that surprised even themselves. Others asked if he would teach them the methods he used, eager to learn skills that could reshape their approach to future missions. The lead instructor addressed the entire group, declaring that the Academy would record Aaron's techniques and integrate them into future training programs. His methods, she said, demonstrated the adaptability and resourcefulness that represented the true spirit of survival. She added that the lesson extended far beyond the valley. Every ecosystem held hidden possibilities, but only those who observed without fear or assumptions could uncover them. Aaron listened quietly. He appreciated the recognition, but his satisfaction came from something deeper. He had taken plants the cadets recoiled from, plants considered worthless, and revealed their potential. He had shown that survival was not an act of desperation, but an act of understanding. He felt a quiet pride that did not need applause. The cadets finished eating, their strength returning with every bite. Conversations grew lively again. The valley, once filled with tension and despair, now buzzed with renewed energy. Some cadets laughed for the first time in days. Others shared pieces of the roasted roots among themselves as if celebrating a small victory. As the sun rose higher, the instructors ended the trial, praising the cadets for their endurance, but commending Aaron specifically for his innovation. He packed the remaining food into his cloth, knowing he no longer needed it, but unwilling to waste what he had worked so hard to create. When the group finally left the valley, Aaron walked at the front, not because he claimed leadership, but because the cadets naturally followed the one who had given them strength when they needed it most. The instructors watched in silence, aware that something had shifted among the students. The human who many believed would struggle had instead redefined the very meaning of the test. In the end, the trial became more than a challenge of endurance. It became a lesson in perception. What was once feared became nourishment. What was once dismissed became valuable. And what was once considered impossible became a demonstration of human resilience and ingenuity. Aaron carried this knowledge with him, knowing it would guide him in the challenges ahead. The trial ended not with hunger or despair, but with understanding, and that was the strongest victory he could have achieved.